السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. تعثر النظام العالمي ولم تعد قيامه تفرض التقليد. لم يعد من الممكن إجبار وإكراه إيران على صندوق الاحتواء النووي. لعل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أشارت إلى أنها ستشدد العقوبات على إيران من أجل زيادة الضغط على الجمهورية الإسلامية للموافقة على الشروط الأمريكية الأوروبية فيما يتعلق بالاتفاق النووي. على وجه التحديد يقول المسؤولون الأمريكيون إنهم يفكرون ويتدارسون كيفية استهداف مبيعات إيران من النفط الخام إلى الصين. بشكل منفصل تشجع الولايات المتحدة محاولات منظمة خلق في تأجيج احتجاجات محلية على خلفية نقص المياه في محافظة خوزستان في تحد أوسع لحكومة السيد رئيسي المقبلة كسبيل آخر للضغط، بالإضافة إلى سلسلة من الضغوط الأمريكية الأخرى. بالأمس خلص المجلس الأعلى للأمن القومي الإيراني إلى عدم العودة إلى خطة العمل الشاملة المشتركة وفقا للشروط والقيود التي تضعها الولايات المتحدة والاتحاد الأوروبي. فما هي المعوقات وما هي التداعيات الاستراتيجية لقرار المجلس الأعلى للأمن القومي الإيراني؟ وإقليميا ما تبعات الخروج العسكري الأمريكي المزمع من أفغانستان والعراق وبقائه بمسميات وتوصيفات جديدة، وما يعني ذلك لمكانة أمريكا في المنطقة اليوم؟ وهل طالبان اليوم كما طالبان السابق؟ لقراءة أعمق ورؤية أشمل لهذه التطورات ولماذا هي مهمة، يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من العاصمة الإيطالية روما السيد أليستر كروك، الدبلوماسي البريطاني السابق ومؤسس ومدير منتدى النزاعات. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Alistair Crook, Director of Conflicts Forum, formerly a senior British diplomat and advisor on Middle East issues to the EU Foreign Policy Chief. Welcome always to Min الداخل from the inside, Alistair.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for being here. Pure pleasure always to have you. Well, Your Excellency, you believe it is clear from Biden's narrative that his masters, between quotations, do not at all want to think through or address the new strategic realities of the region. They do not care for any searching examination of its new circumstance. They want rather to go in the opposite direction to epistemological purity. What does that mean, Alistair, and who are his masters?
What it means really is we're stuck with old, absurd narratives that no longer serve the purpose. They haven't changed in decades, and they go on the same language about Russia, that Russia is a small state that is insignificant, about Iran that is perpetually a threat, and for the last 20 years is said to be on the verge of a nuclear bomb. And so we go on with these old narratives because actually they can't think through. It has been so much preoccupied with the domestic tensions in the United States that really no attention has been given. It was really all about getting rid of Mr. Trump and then replacing him with Biden and the blue Democratic administration. And so very little thought has been given about Iran. There's a very optimistic narrative that has been written about Iran, how it must agree to a new JCPOA, and of course Iran will do so. They were flexible in the past, they will be flexible in the future. Iran is capable of walking back its negotiating position. Why do they think this? I don't know, because this doesn't seem to be based in Iran as it is today. That's Iran of 10 years ago. It's not the Iran of today, where the political pendulum has swung, where people feel differently. There's hardly a reformist in the Majlis, in the parliament in Iran, representing Tehran today. We have a different group of people. The mood has changed, and they don't see Europe as being that effective, competent, organizational structure anymore. They see it as rather dysfunctional. and not capable. When they look to China, when they look to Russia, they see much more, if you like, functioning structures of state. And China has economic power. It has technology. And that is more important now to Iran. Iran sees itself as becoming Iran through technology. It has some of the most advanced engineering institutions in the world in Iran, and it wants not just to be a dependent, if you like, outlier on the global economic system, but wants to develop itself in its own Iranian way.
Well, Alistair, the Iranian Supreme National Security Council has concluded no going back to the JCPOA on the terms proposed by the US and the EU. What are the obstacles and the strategic ramifications, and why it matters?
The obstacles are really very plain. That essentially America is asking Iran to accept restrictions which were never in the 2015, without even giving the same benefits of the 2015 agreement. So they're asking for more and offering less. And I think this is a reflection also of the way in which the goalposts have moved all the time. First of all, it was no enrichment was possible. Then it was minimal enrichment, but then there were other restrictions. Then there was the breakout capacity had to be limited. And now we have all of those things, plus new restrictions that they have to agree, give assurances that if they come back into the JCPOA, then they will put ballistic missiles and their relationship with other movements in the region on the table for negotiation.
True.
So this is why it is. And really at the end of it, Iran understands that all of these secondary sanctions that have been added layer upon layer upon layer, that if just the formal, if you like, sanctions that reflect the JCPOA are lifted, it will benefit Iran's economy not that much. Iran has changed its economy. It's become much more export orientated, and it will not be that benefit. Iran now has turned and is looking much more to the east than it used to look to the west. So a huge shift in, if you like, Iran, and then a huge shift in the strategic position, where Iran now has deterrence, or really more significant deterrence than ever before in the region.
Right. And this is not only on the economic level, also when it comes to the military level. As we all know, Alistair, Zionism, appealing specifically to Jewish zealots, had also promised the total Judaization of Al-Quds, a project that is contrary to international law, a project that entails illegal land theft and the total ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians from their ancestral homes. Now, this project has come to a total standstill, with Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Nasrallah announcing recently that Hezbollah, as well as other members of the Axis of Resistance, which they termed as Al-Quds Axis, will from now on, from here on, militarily involve themselves in defending Al-Quds from these vicious attempts at Judaizing it. Will Israeli civilian and military societies, Alistair, heed to Sayyid Nasrallah's warning, or will they, in their traditional arrogance and chutzpah, dismiss his words as being mere empty threats?
I think they're frightened by it, and they know. And we even have Tom Friedman in the New York Times who says, you know, the nuclear bomb issue, the nuclear threat that everyone has been obsessing about is irrelevant now. Iran, Hezbollah, even the Houthis have armories of smart cruise missiles, of swarm drones in their capacities now that threaten, that surround Israel on all sides, surround American bases in the region. It completely inverts the strategic position. It's as fundamental as the introduction of the longbow was many centuries ago in changing the whole nature of warfare in Europe at that time. The new weapons, render the old calculus irrelevant. They can damage and destroy the strategic hubs of Israel right across the state. Even the Houthis have missiles that can hit it. We saw last September when one entity, we don't know whom because no information, landed missiles absolutely centrally down the cooling towers of a Saudi Arabian Aramco refinery at Abqaiq, damaging it.
True.
Abqaiq, and still no one knows where they came from. Still no one saw them. Still no one has a defense against that. So in a sense, all of this talk about the nuclear issue is really almost irrelevant. The new strategic balance, the strategic military edge lies with Iran and the resistance front now, and not with Israel. And so when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah made that statement, it's strategically huge, because now the whole issue is no longer about two-state solution, no longer even about lifting the siege on Gaza. It is about Al-Aqsa. It is about Jerusalem. And that is something that appeals to all Muslims, whatever sect across the world.
About all Palestine, from the river to the sea. True.
Yes, and also because, in a sense, Al-Aqsa has become the only real spiritual center for Muslims. Of course, Mecca and Medina are there, but they've become so commercialized and so much a money-making project, whereas Al-Aqsa is the spiritual home. It was from there that the Prophet ascended from the rock.
Right. That said, Alistair, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we will talk more about the Chinese resistance economy. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. Alasdair Crooke, founder and director of Conflicts Forum. Welcome back, sir. Well, Sun Tzu's The Art of War advises that to secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands. Yet the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. Therefore, the clever combatant imposes his will and does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed upon him or on him. This is the essence of the Chinese resistance economy today. Tell us more about this approach, Alistair, and why is it important?
Well, okay, I will about the economy, but what you've just described was really about how Iran has, if you like, faced a major, if you like, deterrence, conventional deterrence. And the West has just continued and not listened and not looked at what is happening. And now today the whole pattern has been inverted. And I think we're seeing this also in the economic sphere. China is finding a new balance of an economy. It's a different economy because it really is one in which people do not, it's not a cost plus economy. Education is provided, housing is cheap, transport is cheap. Everything is much cheaper in China, and therefore the cost of materials, the cost of an economy is much more limited. In Europe, everything is cost plus, very different. And so what we're seeing now is a shift towards a different form of economies in the rest of the world, leaving America and Europe with their high-cost economies and economies that are finding it very hard to compete against the new modes of resistance economies emerging around the world.
Now, Alistair, with the collapse of the Soviet Union came also the fall of the geopolitics of land power. Russia has totally withdrawn from the Middle East, but some of its affiliates or some of its notions have, and connections, of course, established during the times of bipolarity were somehow conserved. as well as the image of the Russia as the geopolitical alternative to the West, still lived in the societies of the Middle East. Today, can we presume, can we say that there is a vigorous Russian return to the Middle East? And also noteworthy that Israel is concerned and perplexed over a possible new Russian policy on Syria.
Yes, absolutely, but not in the same way as the American is in the Middle East. Russia has no desire to try and manage and control and micromanage the Middle East. It can't do it. It doesn't want to do that. It will step in. It will, if it's asked to mediate, it will involve itself. But it is not trying to lay down, if you like, a paradigm for the future of the Middle East, and it won't do that. It's understood the lessons from Afghanistan 20-odd years ago. They're not going to repeat those mistakes again. So, yes, there's a difference. And we see this, what you've just described, very clearly in what's happening in Afghanistan. The Americans suddenly left in the middle of the night. They switched off the electricity, didn't even tell the host they were going, and then they were gone from Bagram Air Base. And it is now basically Russia and China acting together that are in the driving seat, trying to stop Afghanistan returning to being a destroyed society in the midst of civil war. And it is the Chinese who are speaking so toughly to the Taliban, really saying, you know, no major bloodshed, no civil return to civil war, and an end to the opium poppy rat line going out of the country.
Sure.
And this is a big change that we have Russia and China doing this, and we have Russia taking a harder line, as you said, on overflights by Israel into Syria. Why is they doing that? I think partly it's because of the talks with Iran. The JCPOA seem to be souring. The Americans are moving away from talks, saying they're getting bored with the talks. They're going to resort to new sanctions on Iran's links with China in order to put pressure on them to come back to the table. And at the same time, we see the new president-elect of Iran taking a tougher stand and saying that the Americans actually have to lift the sanctions and that Iran
totally, yes.
Totally,
yes.
and Iran is not going to give further concessions. So both sides seems to be, so we may be moving to a period where both sides are distancing themselves and removing themselves from Vienna at this point. And of course, what does that mean? It means, because we've been reminded of that throughout this period, that then the military option comes back onto the table again, ultimately, in some way. Whether unilaterally, whether deniably, whether by concealed form or not, military option. And that is, of course, dangerous in the sense that it can easily lead to war. And so I think when you see Russia taking a tougher stand against Israeli missiles and coming in fired by F-16s into the vicinity of Aleppo, which the Russian air defenses shot down 7 out of 8 of them. When you see things like that happening, maybe it's a sign that the Russia and China are taking stock of what's happening in Vienna and preparing for what may be coming next. Clearly, clearly, Iran understood this when they made their changes. They weren't naive and thought that the Americans were going to back down and that they would come up with new proposals. I'm sure of that. So they are expecting. So everyone is really, if you like, preparing and is actually formulating for the possibility of conflict coming back to the region. If that is the case, that the talks do fail, it's not clear yet fully, but if they do fail, I think Russia and China are preparing against the possibility of that happening, just as China is preparing against the possibility of something escalating concerning Taiwan.
Sure, in the South East Sea, sure. That's very true. Alistair, you have been to Afghanistan and you've worked there, as you just said. Why do you think that today's Taliban may be truly new and the shift could transform the West Asia region? What has changed?
I think there are some really notable changes from the Taliban that I knew, which was the older generation. But that one, Taliban, was entirely, if you like, Pashtun-centric. The ethnic group, largely in the south of Afghanistan, was Pashtun-centric. It was a very rigid form of government that was based more on tribal law, Pashtunwali, than really on parts of Islam. It was also Deobandi at that time. But it was a very rigid type of structure. And they crushed the Shi'i Hazaras, and they crushed and tried to crush the Tajiks. Now that's changed. I can't believe it, really. I mean, there's Hazaras in the Taliban. There's Tajiks part of the Taliban. I mean, it is much more inclusive. In many ways, it's a radical change. What did they do when they first came, when the American withdrawal happened? They went to Tehran. They didn't treat Iran as apostate. They went and sought its help and gave them assurances that there would not be a civil war if they could stop it, before even they were asked for those assurances. They did the same in Russia. So it is different. Whether it'll work or not, of course, we have to wait and see. It's not easy to do that.
Right, we have to wait and see. Alasdair Crooke, Director of Conflicts Forum, formerly a senior British diplomat and advisor to the EU Foreign Policy Chief. Thank you very much for sharing your deep perceptions, Alasdair.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to have you. Well, to read more of Alasdair Crooke posts, do tune in to Al-Mayadeen English for an exclusive weekly commentary. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.